So let's go in chronological order. First with that 4 p.m. kickoff from the Fiesta Bowl, Michigan and TCU. So what are going to be the keys for Michigan to try? Like, what can Michigan do to be able to take control of this game from start to finish and try to exert it in a way that the Wolverines have done against most of their opponents?
Don't give up the big plays. I mean, that's we saw it. We saw it against Purdue. We saw it against Ohio State. We've seen it a lot with Michigan this year. You can move the ball on them to a degree in the open field, but once this field starts to get short, can you finish drives and put the ball in the end zone? We saw TCU against Kansas State. Now, one of those touchdowns that wasn't a touchdown was a touchdown. They didn't get credit for it, but we have seen TCU kind of struggle in those situations. A lot of what TCU does is explosive plays to get points on the board. If TCU's in a red zone situation or in whatever you want to call it, inside the 40, inside the 30, whatever kind of scoring zone you prefer, if TCU is in those situations, will they be able to finish drives against Michigan? That's what it's going to come down to, because TCU's not going to beat Michigan by playing defense. It's going to have to outscore it in some way, because Michigan's offensive line is going to be able to help them move the ball against that defense. So you've got to outscore it. You've got to hit big plays. And if you're Michigan, you just got to keep them kicking field goals like you did to Purdue and like you did to Ohio State.
I was going to say the exact opposite thing. Well, the same thing, but for the other side of the football.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. So if you look at TCU's defense on a down-and-down basis, they're really pretty good. The one weakness so far this year is that they have given up the explosive pass play too often. That's kind of the one area that you can typically hit them. Most teams do not run on TCU all that effectively. And TCU is not huge up front, but they do a really good job with stunts and blitzes and angles to keep people off balance. I think the perfect example of that, honestly, is the Texas game. I mean, in some of that duo stuff that Texas was running, I mean, TCU was able to use one guy to consistently influence two blockers, and it allowed the linebackers to come free. I mean, look at how they bottled up Bijan Robinson in that game, who's maybe the best back in the country. Now, Michigan is really well coached up front, but you can stymie those guys for a period of time. You're going to have to obviously add to that with what you do on offense and score. But J.J. McCarthy is not above throwing bad interceptions and not above being confused. And Joe Gillespie, ask anybody who coached in the American Conference the past couple of years when he was the DC at Tulsa. This was a really smart hire for Sonny Dykes. It wouldn't shock me if he's able to confuse J.J. McCarthy. I mean, McCarthy really wasn't confused last night. He YOLO balled a pick that, honestly, if Purdue was a better team, could have swung that game potentially, because they had a chance to really put the game away and did not there. They later did. I'll be interested to watch how TCU's offensive line holds up.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to our Wednesday show, we talked about this. Granted, you're going to struggle more against good defensive lines than you do against bad ones. That's kind of a tautology, but think about it. Michigan does have a pretty nice defensive line up front. Kansas State is a really good D-line, and so does Texas. And both those teams were able to give TCU some trouble, as well as Oklahoma State before they got all dinged up. They gave TCU trouble for about 40 minutes there in Fort Worth. So Michigan's D-line has to play really well, and I think TCU has to not allow the explosive pass play and see if Michigan can execute in the red zone. Because honestly, Michigan in the red zone this year has been a bit of an issue on offense.
Jake Moody, a lot of kicks, which is great because he's a very, very good place kicker. But I think that Michigan fans, would have seen more lopsided results if you didn't have to trot out Jake Moody for a bunch of those 27, 31, 32, those field goals where there was a scoring opportunity, but the windows got a little bit tight. McCarthy didn't quite have it. And, even though that run game's very, very good, and remember, Blake Corum not coming back out for the rest of the season, they had trouble in some of those short yardage situations and had to settle for some kicks as well.
But they didn't have any trouble in them yesterday, and they didn't have much trouble in them against Ohio State.
You think they're getting better in that situation, or is that more reflective of the Purdue and Ohio State defenses?
Ohio State's defense is good, first of all, but I mean, Purdue's defense has been pretty solid too.
The execution, to grade the performance.
No, I think that J.J. McCarthy's getting better. I think that McCarthy early in the year was probably the biggest hindrance towards Michigan not being able to finish those drives. I think JJ's making better throws in that situation. And I think maybe the play calls have been a little bit better for him in those situations. And they've been able to run the ball. I can't remember the kid's name right now, but he's kind of become their short yardage back since Corum went out, and he's been very effective in that role. I don't think it's as big of a problem for the Wolverines right now as it was maybe even 3 or 4 weeks ago.
That's good to know. I mean, I'm admitting that Big Ten championship game was still in like the third quarter when we started our instant reaction show. I have not gotten back my own eyes on it to grade that film. So I know from our notes and our discussions that, you know, Purdue, to go back to the TCU side of this, Purdue had opportunities that it was not able to turn into touchdowns, and that clearly let the game slip away. So if you want a roadmap for TCU on how to not be able to give yourself a chance to win late, I think that the Purdue script in terms of getting touchdowns in those red zone opportunities certainly has to be on the table. So Alex in the chat asked a question earlier. Let me see if I can pull it up, because I don't think that we've exactly mentioned this, but it's certainly something that is like in the wouldn't it be hilarious. Alex says, who else is hoping for an extremely toxic Ohio State-Michigan national championship game?
ESPN.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, I didn't bring it up on the show last night because we were talking about something else, but I don't know if anybody saw it. But after the game, you know, on the Fox set, the post game, they're interviewing, like they've got the entire Michigan team over by the set. It's Mike Hill, it's, you know, Brady, it's Matt, it's Reggie, and it's Urban. And Harbaugh's up there with them. And Harbaugh and Urban Meyer could not be in a bigger battle to get as far away from one another as possible. Like they were on the very opposite ends of the desks, and they did not look like they had any interest in moving closer to one another. It was hilarious.
That doesn't surprise me. I will say now, every time I watch Jim Harbaugh on TV, and I think the guy's an awesome football coach, and it's amazing how he's bounced back. It does. There was a meme on Instagram. I forgot who posted this, but it was like your parents on FaceTime. Like Harbaugh always looks like he's like too close to the camera, or just like how does this thing work? It's pretty awesome. One thing I'm interested in is how deep can TCU go on Michigan, right? Teams, for the most part, have not chucked it deep on the Wolverines this year. And part of this, I think, is going to be, can Michigan sit in too high and force TCU to execute underneath? And that means that they're getting pressure, they're getting line movement, that they're compressing that pocket around Max Duggan without needing to blitz. But just looking at the stats, that is something that stands out to me, is that most teams have not gone deep on Michigan. And I want to see if you can.
Yeah, I do think that for like, this is not our interest, but for NFL evaluators, you know, Quentin Johnson is somebody who's kind of climbed up draft boards this year. I think this will be a very important game for him as far as his possible first round future if he's able to do so. But